Daytona Beach in March 1974, the 10-day corporate festival with vendor tents and merchandise trucks, and 100,000 people who drove down an RV and were not entirely sure which end of the motorcycle to sit on. The Daytona of 1974 was something smaller, rawer, and considerably more interesting. Giacomo Agostini, 15-time world champion, the greatest Grand Prix motorcycle racer alive, arguably the greatest who had ever lived, arrived at the Daytona International Speedway for the first time in his career. He had never raced at Daytona. He had never raced on an American circuit. He had just switched from his beloved MV Agusta to a Yamaha TZ750 two-stroke, a completely different machine on a completely different continent in front of riders who had spent their careers learning every foot of the banked Daytona Tri-Oval. Kenny Roberts, who would go on to become the most dominant American road racer of his generation, was so confident of the outcome that he announced to the press before the race that he was going to eat Agostini alive. The temperature that day hit 90 degrees. The crowds exceeded 65,000 people. The race, shortened slightly that year because of the oil crisis, was the most widely watched motorcycle event in America in 1974. Agostini led from the holeshot. He never gave up the lead. He won in his first attempt on a bike he had been testing for weeks on a circuit he had never seen. Kenny Roberts had to publicly retract his prediction. He said afterward that he could not believe Agostini was a human being. That moment, that specific morning in March 1974, is as good a place as any to begin the Florida motorcycle story, because it captures exactly what Florida was in the 1970s. It was the place where the rest of the world came to prove something. And the culture that formed around that proving ground was unlike anything else in American motorcycling, before the dealers ruined it. To understand what Florida motorcycle culture was in the 1970s, you have to understand what living in Florida meant in that era. Because the state that exists today, the retirement condo, theme park, 6-lane highway Florida of 2026, is not the place these riders knew. Florida in the 70s was still genuinely wild in ways that are difficult to communicate to anyone who did not experience it. Portions of the Everglades that are now developed strip malls were impenetrable swamp. The stretch of A1A, the coastal highway that runs along Florida's Atlantic side, from Daytona down through New Smyrna Beach and Canaveral, and then south along the Treasure Coast, had traffic that today's riders would not recognize. You could run that road at 5 in the morning and not see another vehicle for 20 minutes at a stretch. Just the Atlantic on your left, the Florida scrub on your right, and whatever machine you had built to the standard you had built it, the weather. I need to say something specific about the weather because it is the foundational fact of everything that followed. 365 days of riding weather, not comfortable, inspiring riding weather every one of those days. Florida in August with the humidity sitting at 90% and the temperature at 95, and the afternoon thunderstorms that appear with no warning will test your commitment to year-round riding. But rideable. Everyday rideable. No storing the bike for winter. No watching the calendar for the first break in temperature. No 6-month gap in your relationship with a machine that lets rust form where your attention had been. The riders who lived in Florida in the 1970s rode continuously in a way that riders in Ohio or Wisconsin or New England could not. And that continuity did something specific to the culture. It selected for people who were serious, who maintained their machines obsessively, because a machine that fails in the Florida heat with 40 miles of nothing in any direction is a serious problem. Who understood their bikes at a level that the weekend rider never reaches, because weekend riders become experts only at riding, while year-round riders become experts at everything. Florida also had the military. The Pensacola Naval Air Station, the United States Navy's primary aviation training facility, commissioned in 1914, the cradle of naval aviation, sat on Florida's panhandle and generated a constant rotation of young servicemen and veterans who were either stationed there or had trained there and stayed. Jacksonville had Naval Station Mayport. Tampa had MacDill Air Force Base. The entire I-4 corridor connecting Tampa to Orlando to Daytona had military installations whose populations turned over regularly and whose members, young, physically fit, mechanically inclined, trained for high-stress environments, found motorcycles the natural choice for transportation in a state where the weather permitted it and the pay grade suggested a used Sportster was more practical than a new car. The Vietnam veterans who came back to Florida, and many did, through the military bases and through the climate, which after years of humid jungle warfare felt like a reasonable landscape, brought with them the same thing they brought to California, Ohio, and New York. The need for something that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense. The motorcycle absorbed it in Florida the same way it absorbed it everywhere else. But in Florida, the absorption happened faster and more completely because the riding never stopped. And at the center of all of it, like a gravitational force that organized the entire Florida motorcycle world around itself once a year, was Daytona. The Daytona 200 began on January 24th, 1937 on a 3.2-mile course that used the actual beach, hard-packed sand, alternating with public road, the finish determined by the tides. The race ran until World War II, interrupted everything, then resumed in 1947 with 176 riders in a city where all the hotel rooms were full and local families opened their homes to visiting racers because there was nowhere else to put them. By 1961, the race had moved to the Daytona International Speedway, the same facility that hosts the Daytona 500. The motorcycle circuit used the tri-oval with its 31-degree banking, the same banking NASCAR used, the same surface that took vehicles to speeds that the original beach course could never have permitted. In 1964, the motorcycle race was approved to use the full banking for the first time. The speeds that followed were extraordinary. By the early 1970s, the Daytona 200 had become the most attended AMA motorcycle race in the country, with crowds that exceeded 65,000. At the peak of its popularity, chartered airliners were bringing European race fans to Daytona Beach because the race had become genuinely international. The best riders in the world competing against the best Americans on a circuit that rewarded both raw speed and tactical intelligence in ways that pure street circuits could not. Dick Mann won on a Honda CB750 in 1970, the first victory for Honda at Daytona, and in many ways the opening shot of the Japanese machine's dominance of the decade that followed. Jarno Saarinen of Finland, the 250cc world champion, won in 1973. Agostini won in 1974. Kenny Roberts, who would win 3 consecutive Grand Prix World Championships starting in 1978, was the benchmark American of the era, a Northern California flat track product who brought an aggression and a technical understanding to road racing that the Europeans found difficult to counter. But here is the thing about Daytona that the current version of Bike Week tends to obscure. The race was the reason. Not the vendor tents, not Main Street, not the custom bike show, which was genuinely worth attending and which we will get to. The race was the reason thousands of people made the journey to Florida every March. Riders came from everywhere. Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New York, states where March was still cold, where the garage felt close and the road felt distant, made the journey to Florida for the race and the culture around it. They rode down on machines that had been maintained through the winter with exactly this trip in mind. They rode A1A for the first time in the year. They ran the speedway banking as spectators and felt something in their chests that was difficult to name, but was not difficult to recognize. And in the evenings, on Main Street in Daytona Beach, they gathered. Not in the organized, permitted, sponsored way that Main Street operates today. In the way that happens when thousands of people who share a specific obsession find themselves in the same place with nowhere to be and nothing to do but talk about the thing that brought them there. If you were in Daytona in March in the 1970s, if you came down on your bike from wherever you were from and spent a week in the Florida warmth while the race played out, drop a comment right now. Tell me what year. Tell me what you rode. Tell me what you remember about Main Street before it got organized. I want every story from that era, and I mean that. Florida in the 1970s was the most honest laboratory for motorcycle durability that existed in America. Not the most pleasant laboratory, the most honest. The Florida heat is not a metaphor. It is a specific, quantifiable thing that happens to mechanical systems. an air-cooled Harley-Davidson shovelhead in Jacksonville in July, idling in traffic on US 1 with the temperature at 94 and the humidity at 90%, is working at the outer edge of what the design intended. Oil degrades faster. The carburetor jets require different calibration than what works in Pennsylvania in April. The electrical system, already the weakest point of the AMF-era Harley, responds badly to heat and humidity in combination. Florida riders who rode Harleys in the 1970s became experts in those machines, not because they wanted to, but because the machine demanded it. The shovelhead that was not tuned specifically for the Florida climate was not going to run reliably in the Florida climate. There was no acceptable alternative to understanding the system. A new 1970 Harley-Davidson Sportster cost approximately $2,000. A factory worker at one of Florida's manufacturing facilities, and Florida had significant manufacturing employment in the 70s before the service economy replaced it, earning a median industrial wage of around $7,500 per year, could buy that Sportster for about 3 months of gross pay. It was not cheap, but it was genuinely attainable for a working man who chose to prioritize it. If you are old enough to remember when a new Sportster cost $2,000, and some of you watching this absolutely are, and you are the people whose memories I need in the comments, then you already understand the specific frustration of watching the same basic motorcycle cost $20,000, then $25,000, then $30,000 in base price over the next 50 years. That is not inflation. The inflation-adjusted price of a 1970 Sportster in 2026 dollars would be somewhere around $15,000 to $17,000. The actual price is nearly double that. The difference is not engineering. The difference is who the manufacturer decided it was selling to. The Japanese machines came into Florida the same way they came into every market. Honda's CB750, released in 1969, was faster, smoother, more reliable, and cheaper than anything Harley was producing. Dick Mann rode one to victory at Daytona in 1970 on a machine that had been in production for less than a year, and every Florida rider who watched that race understood something was changing. By 1972, the Kawasaki Z1 900 inline 4 was available, and it was faster still. By the mid-1970s, a significant portion of Florida's motorcycle community was riding Japanese machines that started every morning, regardless of humidity, that did not require a specific understanding of carburetor jets and oil weight variations based on ambient temperature. That simply worked. The Florida motorcycle landscape in the 1970s was consequently more diverse than the mythology suggests. You had Harley loyalists who would ride nothing else and had become formidable mechanics from necessity. You had Japanese bike riders who appreciated reliability and chose their machines accordingly. You had British Iron, Triumph Bonnevilles and BSA Gold Stars and Norton Commandos, ridden by the cafe racer community that had crossed from England and found Florida's straightaways and coastal roads appropriate to their machines. And you had the custom builders, the men who worked in Florida garages, building machines that had no direct equivalent anywhere in the industry, customs designed for Florida roads, Florida heat, Florida humidity, Florida's specific version of the American dream, which involved riding the length of A1A at sunrise with absolutely nothing to answer to for the next 8 hours. The culture these Florida riders built, year-round riding, deep mechanical knowledge, a community that formed around actual skill, disappeared not because riders stopped caring. It disappeared because an industry replaced it with something that looked the same and cost 10 times as much. The world you are riding in today is nothing like the world they built in. The prices are different. The dealer tactics are different. The gear brands have been sold to private equity. The OEM tires on your new bike are a worse compound than what you can buy retail. The 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible is the document that closes that gap. Tire testing data, gear certification breakdown, dealer scripts that work right now. Link in the description. And if you rode in Florida in the 1970s, drop a comment. Your city, your bike, the road you still think about. I want every story. Act 4, The Rat's Hole, and the Chopper Show, The Rat's Hole. Custom Chopper Show at Daytona Bike Week began in 1971. By the mid-1970s, it had become the most important custom motorcycle exhibition in the country. More influential in many ways than the bike show circuit that operated through the rest of the year, because Daytona had an audience that no regional show could match. The machines that appeared at the Rat's Hole in the 1970s were the product of exactly what the 1970s motorcycle culture produced everywhere in America: garage builders, men with no formal training and no backing who had developed extraordinary fabrication skills from necessity and had turned that skill toward creating something that had never existed before. Florida had its own community of those builders, shaped by the same forces that shaped them elsewhere, but with specific local character. The Florida chopper was not quite the California digger. The influence of Arlen Ness's Bay Area work was present: the low-slung geometry, the flat bars, the frame following the ground rather than reaching for the sky, but Florida builders adapted the form for their environment. Long runs of flat highway rather than mountain switchbacks. A culture that was connected to the beach and the sun in a way that California's culture was, but the Midwest's was not. Colors that were bolder. Machines that were designed to be looked at in direct sunlight rather than in the filtered light of a garage show. The Rat's Hole drew builders from across the country to Daytona every year. Florida provided the stage, the rest of America provided the talent. And somewhere in that combination, Florida's weather, Florida's roads, Florida's specific version of the rider community, and the annual convergence of Bike Week, a culture form that was genuinely irreplaceable. The photographs from the 1973 Bike Week archived by the Vintagent tell you something about what it actually looked like. The street lined with customized Harleys and Hondas. A VW-powered trike that looks like something Big Daddy Ed Roth would have drawn on a cocktail napkin at 2 in the morning. Triumph Customs, BSA choppers, the occasional Japanese machine ridden by someone who was there for the racing rather than the culture. A lone policeman watching from the sidewalk. The specific texture of a community that had organized itself around a shared passion without any assistance from a marketing department. That texture is gone from Daytona. The organization happened in 1986, when dealers and authorities and the Chamber of Commerce sat down together and agreed on a 10-day structured festival. The organization improved safety and reduced conflict and produced the event that 500,000 people attend today. And it produced something that is not the same thing as what it replaced. I'm not saying the old way was better in every respect. People died at Daytona in the 1970s in ways that they do not die at modern Bike Week. And that matters. But the specific character of a gathering that organized itself around riders rather than around an event, that is genuinely gone. Florida enacted its Universal Motorcycle Helmet Law in September 1967 under pressure from the Federal Highway Safety Act of 1966, which effectively told states to mandate helmets or lose federal highway funding. By the early 1970s, 47 states had complied with that mandate. Florida's riders fought it from the beginning. The American bikers aiming toward education, ABATE, organized in Florida and lobbied for over 30 years against the universal requirement. The argument they made was the same argument riders made everywhere. The risk of riding without a helmet falls on the rider. No one else is endangered by an uncovered head. The government's interest in my personal safety does not override my right to make decisions about my own body. In 1976, Congress removed the financial penalty on states that refused to enforce helmet laws, responding to exactly the political pressure that Florida's riders and their counterparts around the country had been generating. Within 2 years, 28 states had repealed their requirements. Florida did not immediately repeal, its law remained in place, but the battle continued. Florida riders finally win in 2000 when Governor Jeb Bush signed a bill allowing riders over 21 to ride without helmets, provided they carried a minimum of $10,000 in medical insurance coverage. The Florida Supreme Court had previously ruled the helmet law constitutional in 1969. The repeal took 33 years of organized political work. I personally wear a helmet every time I ride. I am not telling you not to wear one. But the Florida helmet law fight matters to this story because it demonstrates something that the 1970s Florida motorcycle community had that current riding culture often lacks: the organizational will to treat legislative decisions as consequential and to spend decades pushing back against ones they disagreed with. The helmet law battle in Florida was not an angry Facebook post. It was 30 years of sustained lobbying, organized by riders who showed up at committee hearings and wrote letters and built coalitions. That kind of civic engagement came directly from the community structure that the 1970s motorcycle culture had built. The community that could organize and win that way was the community that gathered at Daytona in March, that maintained its machines in the Florida heat, that rode A1A continuously through the year. It had organizational capacity because it had actual community, built around actual shared experience rather than shared marketing demographics. I want to stop the history for a moment and try to describe something that the photographs from the 1970s can suggest, but cannot fully convey. What it actually felt like to ride Florida in that era. A 1A at 4:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, not the race week Tuesday, the ordinary Tuesday that the vast majority of Florida's year-round riders experienced every week. The Atlantic is your right this time because you are running north from Fort Lauderdale toward Palm Beach. The ocean is dark and making it sound. The road is dry and empty, and the temperature is 67 degrees, which after the winter you drove through to get here feels extraordinary on your skin. You are on a 1972 Kawasaki Z1 900. You bought it used from a Navy man who was reassigned to Pensacola and needed to sell it before he moved. You paid $1,200 and you have put the better part of 3,000 miles on it in the 6 months since. You know its sound now, the specific note of the four-cylinder at 6,000 RPM, the way the front end settles when you roll off the throttle entering a curve, the vibration at idle that goes away at anything above 2,000 RPM. You know all of this the way you know it when you have been riding the same machine in the same conditions continuously, which is different from knowing it academically. There are no other vehicles in your lane. There are almost no other vehicles anywhere. The road goes exactly where it goes, straight north along the coast with the occasional curve that the barrier islands produce, and you go with it at whatever speed the road permits. You are not being watched. You are not being managed. You are not participating in an event. You are just a person on a machine on a road at 4:30 in the morning in Florida. And this is what ride was before it became something else. The Florida riders of the 1970s ran A1A. They ran US 41, the Tamiami Trail, which cuts across the Everglades from Miami to Naples, at a time when Everglades National Park had not yet been fully developed, and the road ran through genuine wilderness that felt like the edge of the world if you were running it at dusk on a bike that was entirely dependent on your understanding of its mechanical systems. They ran US 19 up the Gulf Coast through Clearwater and Newport Richey and Spring Hill, through towns that had not yet become suburbs of Tampa. They ran the overseas highway through the Keys, which in the 1970s was still rough enough to be a genuine test for both machine and rider. If you rode any of those roads in the 1970s, and some of you did, and I know some of you are watching this right now with a specific image in your head that these words are bringing back, drop it in the comments. The road, the year, the bike. Whatever you remember. That is what this series exists to collect. The relationship between Florida's motorcycle culture and Florida's military presence in the 1970s is the least discussed and most important chapter of the story. Florida had more military installations per square mile than any state except Virginia and California. Naval Air Station Pensacola, Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville, MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Patrick Air Force Base in Brevard County, Eglin Air Force Base in the Panhandle, and Homestead Air Force Base in South Florida. These installations cycled tens of thousands of young men through Florida every year. Some were stationed, some trained and left. Many trained, left, and came back because the climate was livable, because the cost of living was lower than most of the country, because the motorcycle culture that existed here was something they had found and did not want to leave. The Vietnam veterans who came to Florida in the early to mid-1970s were the same men who went to California, Ohio, and New York. Young, trained, disciplined, carrying something they could not fully explain to anyone who had not experienced it. The motorcycle community in Florida absorbed them the same way it absorbed them elsewhere. But Florida's military density meant the concentration was higher, and the clubs that formed around veteran membership in the 1970s were consequently larger and more organized than their counterparts in states with less military presence. These were not outlaw clubs in the sense that the press used that term. These were veterans who had spent years in organizations that ran on hierarchy and operational discipline, who brought that discipline to their riding clubs, their community activities, and their political organizing. The groups that showed up at Daytona in March from the military communities around Pensacola, Jacksonville, and Tampa rode in formation with a precision that casual club riders could not match. They camped together and maintained each other's machines and did the kind of communal mechanical work that the military teaches without calling it mechanical work. The Rolling Thunder Movement, the veteran motorcycle advocacy organization that eventually produced the annual Rolling Thunder Ride for Freedom in Washington, had its roots in this period and this culture. The visibility that Vietnam veterans found through riding, the voice they developed through the motorcycle community, was not accidental. It came from the specific combination of military organizational culture and motorcycle community that Florida's military density produced in the 1970s. In 1977, Hal Needham directed Smokey and the Bandit. Burt Reynolds played the Bandit. Sally Field played Carrie. Jerry Reed played Snowman. Jackie Gleason played Sheriff Buford T. Justice of Portague County, Texas. Smokey and the Bandit was not a motorcycle movie. It was a car movie, specifically a Trans Am movie, the black 1977 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am that Burt Reynolds drove with a specific nonchalance that became one of the defining image of the late 1970s. The film was set across the American South, from Atlanta to Texarkana, with the band's job being to distract the law while Snowman ran a truckload of Coors beer across state lines. But Smokey and the Bandit matters to the Florida motorcycle story for exactly the reason that Chips mattered to the California motorcycle story. It defined what freedom looked like for an enormous audience. It made the open road and the running from authority and the machine as an instrument of personal liberty into mainstream entertainment. And it is a Florida-adjacent film. The culture it captured, the Southwide outlaw freedom on the highway culture, was the culture that extended from Texas through Alabama and Georgia and directly into Florida's Panhandle and northern counties. The riders who came to Daytona from Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee in the 1970s were from that same culture. The same working-class Southern ethos that Smokey and the Bandit was capturing, the machine as freedom, the road as the answer to anything that needed answering, the authority as something to be outrun rather than obeyed, was the ethos that drove the migration to Daytona every March. If you were one of those riders, if you loaded up and ran south through Georgia every March because Daytona was where the year started, you know exactly what I am describing. And you know the specific way the state line felt when you crossed into Florida and the temperature came up and you understood that the next week was yours. By the late 1970s, the forces that were changing motorcycle culture across the country were changing it in Florida as well. The Japanese machines had created a category of rider who did not need to understand the machine to ride it. The Honda CB750, the Kawasaki Z1, the Yamaha XS650, these were motorcycles that started reliably, ran reliably, and did not demand the diagnostic knowledge that the shovel had demanded. The average Florida rider in 1979 was a different kind of rider from the average Florida rider in 1971. Less mechanically engaged, more numerous, more varied in their backgrounds and their reasons for riding. The dealerships responded to this shift the way dealerships respond to every shift, by identifying the new customer and optimizing their operations to extract maximum revenue from that customer. Florida dealers in the late 1970s were beginning to develop the practices that would eventually make Florida Harley dealerships the most predatory in the country. The transient customer base, snowbirds, tourists, military rotations meant that the consequences of burning a customer were minimal. There was always a new one coming through the door. The heat was also doing something to the character of Daytona. The informal, self-organized character of the early bike week was producing problems that became impossible to ignore. The relationship between law enforcement and the biker community deteriorated through the late 1970s. The criminal element that existed at the margins of any large gathering of people was increasingly visible. By 1986, when the Chamber of Commerce organized the event into its current structured form, the informal version had run its course. The organization that followed was necessary and produced something genuinely better in many respects. But it was not the same thing. The Daytona that riders came to in 1974 to watch Agostini beat Roberts in 90-degree heat on a machine he had never raced on a circuit he had never seen, that Daytona required nothing from you except to show up with a machine and a reason and the road sense to get there. The Daytona that exists today requires a hotel reservation and a wristband and a level of organization that the 1970s version would not have recognized as the same event. Harley-Davidson's pricing trajectory did the rest. A new 1976 Electra Glide was $3,375. A working man in a manufacturing job could buy it. By the early 1990s, the same motorcycle, adjusted for actual wage growth rather than just inflation, was priced out of the working class market. Harley had decided it was selling aspirational status rather than transportation. Florida dealers, with their tourist traffic and their snowbird wealth and their bike week volume, leaned into that decision harder than dealers anywhere else. The working class rider who had built Florida's motorcycle culture in the 1970s was gradually priced out of the market for the machine that had been the center of that culture. He did not stop riding. He bought used. He maintained what he had with the mechanical knowledge he had spent years developing. He kept the bikes going long past what the market expected. But the pipeline that had been bringing new working class riders into the culture via new affordable machines closed. And when a culture stops bringing in new people from the community that built it, it begins to serve a different community.